Monsieur le Premier ministre, Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs, Excellencies, Ambassadors, Governors, friends, thank you very much for having me on air rather than in real life. And thank you very much for having honored me as you have. I wish I was with you. Unfortunately, that has not been made possible, but I'm really thrilled to participate in the event on this occasion. I have participated in many of your meetings and I have great memories of the work that we did together in my previous incarnation as Minister of Finance for France. And certainly the work that we did together on Islamic finance has been, I think, a great progress in making sure that all banking methods, categories and principles can be made useful in all corners of the world. Now, what I thought I would do this morning on the occasion of your meeting is address you in my capacity now as Managing Director of the IMF and explain to you from my vantage point what I see as key challenges and key priorities in the Middle East, and particularly in Arab countries in transition, where you operate a lot of your businesses. And also tell you what I think the IMF can do and what role it can play in that regard. So let me turn to the challenges. There are clearly lots of challenges. Lots of things are happening on the ground, and you are very familiar with many of them. From our vantage point, what we are seeing on the ground is newly elected governments in many of those countries that have gone through their transition. We are also seeing, unfortunately, economic circumstances that are really putting the countries under stress. And let me just turn to those particular characteristics of the economic situation of those countries. First of all, a difficult external environment. Because clearly what is going on in the world, whether it's the US fiscal cliff and debt ceiling, whether it's the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis and financial uncertainties, whether it's the slowdown of global growth, all of those external factors are clearly sources of uncertainty for the region. On the top of it, there are high food prices that are affecting the population of many countries, particularly in the Arab countries in transition. There's also fuel prices and weakening global activity that is weighing on the economies. So far, though, the spillovers from the euro area markets have been limited. Yet, your economies, the economies of the Arab countries in transition, have suffered as a result of reduced tourism, as a result of reduced export, as a result of high policy uncertainty, as a result of lower remittances from those of you country fellows who are stationed outside of the region. And as a result, clearly, growth in the countries in transition has remained relatively low. And I'm saying relatively because there are many countries in the advanced economies that would quite like to have that growth numbers. For instance, this mild recovery that we are seeing is probably in the range of 3.5% to 4%. But it's far below what would be required to address the demand of the populations and the growing employment, particularly acute amongst the young people. In addition to that, there is clearly a concern about the fiscal deficit, which on average is just above 9%, which is quite a high percentage. Equally, the international reserves have fallen quite low, and we have on average about 3 months of international reserves, which is quite a concern. And that leaves, all in all, with a relatively moderate growth, high unemployment rates, high deficit, and international reserves being low, that leaves relatively little fiscal room and little room in general to maneuver for the policy and decision makers in the countries. And of course that is coupled with having to manage rising expectations in the population, because after all, the transition was about raising expectations, responding to those expectations. And it's very difficult to do that in the context of an economic situation that is as I've described it. So it really raises the pressure on decision makers, on policy deciders, and on governmental as well as monetary authorities. So what are the priorities in the Arab countries in transition? Well, first of all, there's one issue that I would like to alert you to, which is obviously a difficult topic, but one where the IMF is going to do more work and compare more best practices around the globe. And that has to do with subsidies. Subsidies, whether it is related to fuel, whether it is related to other commodities, is consuming a lot of GDP. If we look at numbers, roughly 7% of regional GDP. That is a lot of money going into subsidies, which is probably okay if subsidies were addressed to the right target population. But this is not what's happening, and this is not what we are seeing on the ground. And we have various numbers in different countries that indicate that a very large proportion of those subsidies are going to those that need it least. So we will be doing more work, and we believe that it's important for Arab countries in transition to actually address that issue of subsidies and actually address the issue of how the population is best helped by other means than subsidies. That's priority number one. Priority number two is to make sure that government expenditures are adequately spent, properly targeted, and that they respond to social needs as well as stay within fiscal deficits that are sustainable. Third priority, which is in and of itself a difficult one, and for which I'm not going to give all the tips and tricks to actually deliver on them, is to create better jobs and more jobs in the region. There is clearly one underlying factor which will help create jobs, and that will be growth. So all of that is conducive to a solid, sustainable fiscal deficit reduction, proper targeting of government expenditure, reduction of subsidies, and clearly the structural reforms that will be helpful to make the economies of the region competitive. Now, are you relevant in all that? Well, of course you are. And the financial sector is actually critical to make sure that money flows around and goes to where it is most needed, those that actually create value, those that create jobs, those that invest. And that's where clearly the financial and the banking sector can play a major role in making those markets deeper and financing and liquidity accessible to, for instance, SMEs or entrepreneurs that are going to create value and develop activity in the region. It's particularly true when you look at the average loan-to-deposit ratio, which is clearly well below the global emerging and developing country average over the last 30 years. So what it tells you and what it tells me is that you can do a lot for the region by making sure that there is adequate lending facility made available to the entrepreneurs, to the SMEs, and to those that are prepared to invest. As financiers, you can play a crucial role in making sure that this transition of the Arab countries in the region turns out to be a successful transition and one that actually responds to the needs of the people. And in all that, what does the IMF do? Well, the IMF is trying to do its best in the region, using several of our business lines, if you will. The first one is surveillance, policy advice. We give a lot of that to all countries in the region, and we really focus on delivering the best policy advice that will be implementable, that will be giving deliverables on the ground. The second business line that is ours is obviously that of our lending capacity. And we are actively engaged in the region, whether it's with Jordan, where we have put together a loan in excess of 2 billion dollars, whether it's with Morocco, where we have put in place a precautionary loan that is in excess of $6 billion, or whether it's with Yemen, where we put in place very quickly an emergency facility line of $100 million. But we're doing more than that. We're also opening negotiations or pursuing negotiations with countries such as Egypt and maybe a few others that will be calling for our support. Now, in and of itself, it's helpful, but we are also catalyzing support from other institutions, from other countries, from other friends in the region and elsewhere. And the role of the IMF in that respect is very important and well received, and I believe well perceived. We're doing that in a constant dialogue, engaging, reaching out to all the decision policymakers, but also to the social institutions, the unions and other players that matter on the ground, and we will continue to do so. Finally, we're also providing a lot of technical assistance on the ground. When I think of a country like Libya, for instance, we have been providing a lot of technical assistance. The same is true for Tunisia. Now, obviously, there is one country in the region that is suffering through a horrible humanitarian ordeal, and that is obviously Syria, where we are not at the moment offering technical assistance or support, but where hopefully the situation will improve and we will be able to also reach out, give a hand and make sure that that economy is back on track when the political and humanitarian situation is restored to the satisfaction of the people. In conclusion, in addition to thanking you very much for honoring me as you have, I would like to say that in this part of the world there are continuous challenges, huge energy, the expectations of population, particularly the young people who are looking for hope, who are looking for resolution of some of their professional projects, the desire to create business, to develop activity, to be engaged in social life as well as in professional life. And you, financial sector, can of course contribute to that. The private sector has to bring its share and the public sector, through monetary policy, through solid macroprudential tools, can actually help those economies going forward and strengthening over time. We will continue to work as partners. We will be there on the ground whenever we are needed, whenever we are invited, whenever we are asked. And we will provide the best that we have, both in terms of advice, in terms of technical assistance, and if needed, in terms of lending. And we will continue to play our catalyst role in the region. I wish you all a very, very successful meeting. I'm sure that you will be exploring new ways of serving your economies, new way of doing business, new ways of strengthening your financial sector, making it deeper, more effective. And I wish you all the very, very best in doing so. Thank you.